But in terms of Ukraine having no cards, that's just not true. Europe can give Ukraine cards. I think the bigger problem here, if I could reframe your question somewhat, it's, every time that Trump says that Ukraine has no cards, the real problem is that Trump keeps giving cards to Putin. That's what the dilemma is right now. And it's Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff doing that. And then you do have Secretary of State Marco Rubio on the sidelines trying to claw some of those back to get them on Ukraine's side of the equation. But the problem isn't a question of Ukraine not having cards. It's a question of Trump giving Putin too many cards.
Joining us today, John Sweet, retired U.S. Army Colonel, Mark Toth, Foreign Affairs Analyst. Welcome to our program.
Hey, Daniel, thanks for having us back on the show.
Great to be back, Daniel. Thank you.
U.S. is putting pressure on President Zelensky to quickly accept a peace deal that would require Ukraine to surrender Donbass to Russia. Mark, what does it mean, and what kind of moment President Zelensky faces right now?
Yeah, Daniel, it's a great question because this moment in time for Ukraine and Zelensky reminds me of Churchill's never surrender speech that he had to give on June 4th, 1940, after the fall of Dunkirk, the evacuation of Dunkirk. And the odds the stakes here are really just as high. Ukraine is facing immense pressure from President Trump and those around him, especially Steve Witkoff and Kushner, to essentially capitulate to the Russians. And that's not a good thing. You can't surrender the Donbass. That's too key of a fortress belt. There's nothing between it and Kiev and Odessa thereafter. And ISW is reporting that. John can get into that in a second here in terms of just how military disastrous it was. But essentially what President Trump is asking Ukraine to do is to commit military and national suicide. And that just can't be, because if that happens, this isn't just a never surrender moment for Ukraine. It's a never surrender moment for the fate of Western Europe as well. Eastern Europe in the short term, Western Europe in the long term, because then Putin really, in effect, dominates this continent. And we know that just based on Trump's national security strategy that just came out. He's effectively abandoning Europe to itself, abdicating U.S. leadership in NATO, save the Sackler position. Now, there are some stopgap measures happening in terms of Congress saying with the new Defense Authorization Act that certain troop levels can't fall below, et cetera. But the peril is now, the fate of Europe is now, it's not just the fate of Ukraine. John?
Sure, John.
No, I agree. I agree. And I'll add this. As you know, the saying goes, want it bad, get it bad. And right now, Trump wants it bad, and Ukraine will get it bad. Okay, and for exactly the reason that Mark said is, quite frankly, they can't give up their strategic fortress. Okay, it's at the end of the day, it's a condition setter for Russia. In addition to Russia's other demands of a reduced size military, restrictions on certain types of weapon systems, and the lack of NATO forces physically being in Ukraine to assist in their defense, it simply sets conditions for a follow-on invasion that we've seen before, no further than Chechnya, and look no further than understanding that Putin's never going to keep his word. It's only based on moments in time, and this moment in time is what he wants. So all the incentive packages in the world that are being packaged up for Russia to come to the table are not going to convince Ukraine to see any of its territory. And right now it appears that Europe's standing behind Zelensky.
French President Emmanuel Macron warned European allies that US could betray Ukraine in these negotiations. Mark, how close are we to such moment?
Yeah, Daniel, to be determined. Look, it's very clear that the U.S. wants to move beyond not just Ukraine, but Europe as well. Under the Trump administration, the strategy makes that clear. It wants to pivot. It wants to see China as the major pacing threat. But even there, it's somewhat weak in the sense that it's got softer language towards China than in the past. I think Trump envisions a world of business deals, but he's looking past the very real geopolitical issues at stake, the geostrategic issues that are at stake, that Putin sees this world very differently. As John and I recently wrote, Putin isn't interested in Jared Kushner or Steve Witkoff's business deals. He may use those as a means to an end, to get a peace deal on favorable terms to Russia. But in the long run, he's going to continue his machinations to get all of Ukraine and eventually start trying to peel back some of the Baltic states. Or Romania, or potentially, convince Hungary to come over to his side of the equation instead of being a NATO member state. I mean, he has long-term plans for Russia, and they are not good. And so, from that standpoint, I think Trump is doing a disservice to everyone here. Because look, if peace is to come about, it's got to be some type of equitable peace. It's got to take into account the war crimes that Putin has done. It has to take into account the intentional targeting of civilians, the crimes against humanity, the people that perpetrated Bucha early in this war. All of those things need to be taken into account. But it has to be based on a secure peace, and we just don't see that yet.
And John, what is your take on possible U.S. betrayal of Ukraine and Europe?
Well, first, I think betrayal is a strong word. Okay, I believe that Trump, in his own mind, is trying to encourage NATO to take more responsibility for the defense in Europe, and rightly so to some effect. NATO needs to step up. The United States, for the past 50 years, has been the leader, and NATO countries have allowed the United States to do that. So he's turning to NATO, saying you have to do more burden sharing because have to focus our attention now on the Western Hemisphere, but also looking at China. So on that note, I don't necessarily think it's betrayal, but the manner in which he is doing it is gaslighting, if you will, Putin, and his thoughts that he can continue to fight and continue to threaten NATO. So it's having a negative effect, particularly on Ukraine, but it is encouraging Putin to hold his ground and simply to demand more. And right now, the Trump administration appears to be providing more incentives to get Putin to the negotiating table while trying to apply pressure on Ukraine to give up terrain that, quite frankly, it's not prepared to do.
Let's also
hey,
cover...
Daniel,
Sure.
if I could jump in real quickly here.
Sure.
I agree with what John is saying. Look, I don't know that it's so much a betrayal. It's an abdication that's happening. And I think, I come from a military aviation family. And when I was being taught to fly by my grandfather and father, essentially they said, beware of a concept known as get-there-itis. That Trump is so wanting to get to a peace deal that he's not considering all the bad decisions that he might be making going to get to that deal done. You start making those bad decisions in the final stages of flight, that's how you end up crashing on landing. You really have to think things out. He's not doing this. And there's so much about his negotiating position that's just contradictory. For instance, last night he starts calling for elections. Why is he stacking the deck in favor of Putin? It's get-there-itis. He just wants to get a deal done. He's not considering all the implications to Europe, to Ukraine, and your sovereignty going forward, and that's just unfortunate.
And Mark, let's go back to what you said just a few minutes ago about the 2026 National Defense Authorization Act. This is Congress putting the Trump administration in check. Okay, this is Congress saying, hey, the budget for 2026 and 2027 will include $400 million in aid, military assistance to Ukraine. You will not drop U.S. forces from below 76,000 troops in Europe. And oh, by the way, you will retain the leadership mantle there in NATO, the Supreme Allied Commander. So Congress, bipartisan Congress, is holding the Trump administration in check. So not only does he have an issue with Ukraine, but he's having an issue now with Congress. But oh, by the way, according to the 2025 Reagan National Defense Survey, he has an issue with the American public because 68% of the American public support NATO, 59% oppose withdrawing from NATO, 62% want NATO or Ukraine to actually prevail, and another 70% distrust Russia. So he's swimming upstream against American opinion.
Let's also cover most recent President Trump's interview with Politico. It seems like President Trump is now saying again that Ukraine doesn't have the cards. He just said that Russia had a stronger position, stronger negotiating position during this diplomatic process. Mark, is he right?
No, he's wrong. Look, I don't want to underestimate the heavy lift that Ukraine has in front of it. And clearly it's going to take much more European support to make sure that Ukraine doesn't face military setbacks in the near and long term. I don't want to estimate that. But in terms of Ukraine having no cards, that's just not true. Europe can give Ukraine cards. I think the bigger problem here, if I could reframe your question somewhat, it's every time that Trump says that Ukraine has no cards, the real problem is that Trump keeps giving cards to Putin. That's what the dilemma is right now. And it's Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff doing that. And then you do have Secretary of State Marco Rubio on the sidelines trying to claw some of those back to get them on Ukraine's side of the equation. But the problem isn't a question of Ukraine not having cards. It's a question of Trump giving Putin too many cards.
Just mentioned about Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff. We haven't discussed this topic yet, but Steve Witkoff would call Russian aide Kirill Dmitriev and would advise him how to deal with President Trump, how to appease President Trump. Mark, what is your assessment of such diplomatic tactics? Is it a treason or just unprofessional way to conduct business?
Yeah, I vacillate back and forth, Daniel, between whether Steve Witkoff is the most naive man on earth, given how utterly fooled he is at times by Putin, the games that he plays, Kirill Dmitriev's courting of him, Putin's chief special envoy in this process, or whether or not, for business reasons, he's thinking maybe there's deals to be made if he gets to a peace sooner than later. I'm not sure what it is. The historians will have to figure that out. Reporters will have to dig down and determine which of that it is. But either way, it's bad for Ukraine. Steve Witkoff should not be in this equation. He should not be part of these negotiations. He's just not a credible and not someone who's even a fair broker. Even if you wanted to be objective and argue that the U.S. should just be a mediator, this man's not mediating. This man is arbitrating in many ways and to Ukraine's detriment.
Why does he like Vladimir Putin? In one of his interview, he told reporters that he did like Vladimir Putin as a Russian leader.
Yeah, Daniel, either he doesn't understand that Putin commits war crimes, that Putin has enabled the types of tragedies, as we mentioned earlier, that happened in Bucha, or that Putin is campaigning to intentionally target civilians. I just can't buy that. Look, early on, it was easy to give Steve Witkoff a pass. This was a man that was also involved in the peace negotiations in Gaza, and maybe there was only so much information that he could absorb at one time. But now there's no way that he doesn't know these things, that he's primarily focused on trying to get a peace deal with Gaza. I'm sorry, with Putin over Ukraine. In my mind, and again, it's just my personal opinion, I don't have proof of this, I suspect he sees dollar signs, ruble signs in front of him, and is just wanting to get the deal done for Trump so that they can move on and falsely believe that somehow this world that's in competition between Russia and China on one side and the U.S. on the other is just going to all be solved by business deals and transactions. They just don't get it. He's not interested in that. Putin's not interested in that. They've got bigger plans than business deals.
And Colonel Sweet, how can you assess current military situation? Is Ukraine in such bad condition right now as President Trump thinks, and as he tries to present Ukraine doesn't have any kind of cards?
Well, I agree with what Mark said earlier about cards. Ukraine doesn't have U.S. cards, okay? But Ukraine has Europe cards. And more importantly, Ukraine has Ukraine cards. Okay, the Ukrainian military is holding its own. They're defeating Russian forces on the ground. They're still, to this day, killing upwards to 1,000 Russian soldiers a day, upwards to about 7,000 a week. They have turned back multiple assaults, and they continue to do that. Now, where they need help and where they need additional assistance, obviously, is battling the drones and the ballistic missiles. Over 700 drones and 50 plus ballistic missiles fired within the last 24 hours. Against civilian targets. Again, civilian targets, civilian neighborhoods, not military targets, civilian infrastructure, schools, churches, homes, cultural centers. Another word for that could also easily be genocide, but yet nobody wants to use that word when it comes to Russia because they would have to do something about it. Okay, so no, Ukraine's holding its own, and I suspect with additional support from Europe, Ukraine will continue. Now, they'll need support, particularly in air defense. And Mark and I have talked about this a lot in the form of a no-fly zone to one degree, but also in the form of an integrated, layered air defense system. Those two are mandatory. They have to get those two installed in order to continue to fight.
Hey, Daniel, if I could add really
Sure.
quick here, I agree with what John said. The biggest card that Zelensky has right now that he needs to be playing, and he is the card of defiance. He needs to be defiant in the face of these bad deals that are coming his way. And that goes back to basically the defiance that Churchill showed in 1940, saying we'll fight on the streets, the hills, the beaches, wherever. Zelensky needs to draw that line that Ukraine is going to fight to the end, that this notion of freedom, sovereignty, etc., not ceding land and territory is integral to the Ukrainian identity and your core beliefs as a country. Europe needs to see that defiance because then they need to make a calculus. Do they want to see your country fight without additional cards and potentially lose? Or do they realize now is the time to step up because Trump isn't and go all in with things like the no-fly zone? But if I'm Zelensky right now and we're starting to see that, I remain defiant. Don't give in to this. You need to be Churchill. This is back in 1940 when maybe the odds are against you as a country as they were against England after the fall of France and the evacuation of British troops without their equipment from the from Dunkirk. You guys are in a better position than that. You still have your army intact. You still have your equipment intact. Be defiant.
Do you feel that the most strongest card Ukraine has right now is that there won't be any kind of deal without Ukraine?
I do. Look, the strongest card that I see that Ukraine has is the defiance card. And that's not just something that's unique to Zelensky. I see that in Ukrainian after Ukrainian after Ukrainian. You look at these men and women that are fighting on the front lines. That resolve, that defiance to say we're not going to give an inch of our territory unless it makes sense strategically to tactically withdraw for a little while to fool the Russians into taking it so you can counterattack. That's on display. It's on display every time a power node gets hit and you see the firefighters out so that the electrical guys can get in and repair those. It's seen every time people rush into burning apartment buildings, hospitals, schools to save, bring women, children to safety. You see that defiance everywhere. I mean, and as an American, it's admirable. I mean, I don't think the world has seen anything like that kind of defiance since the days of the Blitz in England, when British people showed similar resolve. And look what that resolve ended up getting them, even though they thought the odds were against them. They ultimately prevailed and beat Nazi Germany. I strongly and still believe in my heart Ukraine can win this, but they need Europe's support, and they need it now.
Hey, another word for that, Mark, defiance is national identity. And Ukraine has national identity. Ukraine has pride. Ukraine has its own unique culture. And Ukraine's not going to give that up to Putin. And they're not going to let the United States dictate to them what their future is. There's the U.S. motto. The motto for the U.S. Army is that this we will defend. And right now, Ukraine is upholding that motto.
Colonel Sweet, I would like to ask you about the possibility of Ukraine changing the balance of power on the ground, because we haven't heard any kind of such discussion right now in the media. We just have been hearing about territorial concessions, about negotiations, about Ukraine should surrender Donbass to Russia. But let's also cover the other side of these discussions. How can U.S. help Ukraine to prevail in this fight right now? Because President Trump still has lots of military cards on his table in the White House.
He does. Look, in order to change the battlefield today, Ukraine is going to have to stop. And I say this all the time on this show with you, and Mark and I write it repeatedly, but they're going to have to stop the flow of Russian soldiers into Ukraine. Interdiction is what they're going to have to do. They have to defeat those forces before they arrive into Ukraine, not on the Ukrainian battlefield. They need to get them in their assembly areas, their marshaling areas, their fuel points and logistical hubs, at the airfields, the seaports, the railheads, the highways. They need to hit them there. They need the weapon systems to hit them there. Okay, if that means more ATACMS, more HIMARS, more Storm Shadows, if Germany provides its cruise missile, the Taurus missile, additional artillery, but they need to be fighting them in Russia, not necessarily in Ukraine. I think that's the only way they're going to affect the battlefield is to isolate those forces within Ukraine, okay, to defeat their lines of logistics, okay? We call them exterior lines, but to shut those exterior lines off and to get those forces in in Ukraine to wither on the vine, and then to have to withdraw because they don't have ammunition, life support materials like food, water, and ammunition. That's about the only way they're going to be able to do that. The other way, obviously, again, as Mark and I have said, is you got to stop the drone and missile attacks, and that's either through the no-fly zone, but also striking those weapon systems in Russia before they can launch. It doesn't do any good to shoot the individual missile down. You have to destroy the weapon system in the production facilities where these drones are being made, and that's where Ukraine has to turn its attention. They're focused on the deep strikes against refineries, and that's still a good course of action, but they're going to have to find some balance in the interdiction war.
And
yeah,
Mark,
hey, Daniel, if
sure.
I could quickly add here. I think the biggest weapon that the Ukrainians can get right now, realistically, from the U.S. is actually public opinion. As John pointed out, there's bipartisan support broadly to see Ukraine win. It's like 68%. The vast majority of the country, upwards of 3/4, believes that Russia is the enemy, not our friend. That's the most powerful weapon that you can get. And if the Ukrainians show defiance, if you start drawing these lines in the sand, that look, Trump's not going to cause us to negotiate away our country. That public opinion, Americans like that. They like a scrappy underdog. Ukraine is that underdog, and I think that's your best way forward. And then in the meantime, as we keep repeating, and I don't mean to keep repeating it, but Europe has to step up now.
Thank you, John and Mark, for your time and for your support for Ukraine and insightful answers. Glory to Ukraine.
Hey, thank you, Daniel, for having us back on the show.
Thank you, Daniel. Best.